Hello, everyone. My name is Irvin Moreno Rodriguez, and I'm the program assistant here in the Sara and Sam Schoffer Holocaust Resource Center at Stockton University. I want to welcome everyone to this important program discussion in observance of Black History Month here at Stockton University. The discussion is titled Erasing the Silences of Black Victims During World War II and the Holocaust. And this dialogue is brought to us by Fabulous Flores, Master of Arts in Holocaust and Genocide Studies student, and Dr. Mary Johnson, Adjunct Faculty here at Stockton University in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. After the event today, participants will be able to pose questions to Fabulous and Dr. Johnson. You will be able to pose your questions using the Zoom chat feature. The Zoom button is located at the bottom of your screen, and you will send all of your questions to me, Irvin Moreno Rodriguez, and I should be labeled as host of this program. And like I said, we will leave time at the end to facilitate this Q&A session with everyone. And I know that we have a lot to discuss today, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Mary Johnson. Dr. Johnson?
Thanks, Irvin. Am I unmuted? Yes, I think I am. All right. So thank you. One of the joys of being at Stockton is working with students on their capstones. And Fabulous Flores has been working for the last, I guess, year and a half or more now in examining the omissions, essentially, of why we don't know as much about Afro-Germans, not just in Germany, but in Europe before and during the Holocaust. And in particular, she's very interested in whether we have testimonies. Has there been an effort to collect those testimonies? Or why haven't those testimonies been collected? That's something that she started out being interested in. She has gone on the most interesting sort of journey looking for this information, and she'll take you through this. It's very exciting to work with someone that is discovering every week. And every time I speak with her about what she's doing, there's something new that comes up. So I think she's going to open a real sort of world for us to be thinking about. And I can't think of a better time to be doing this than in Black History Month and thinking about what we do and don't know about it. And so I think we'll turn it over to Fabulous, and she'll start, I think, talking about how she started this whole effort, if you will, and what her initial question was, and then we'll build from that. So I want to turn it over to Fabulous.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. So I guess I'll take you on somewhat of a long journey. This actually kind of started in my senior year at Penn State. I was taking a Holocaust course, and for the final paper, I didn't really know what I was going to write on. And I don't even remember how it happened, but I came across a book in our library titled, I have it next to me, Hitler's Black Victims, The Historical Experiences of Afro-Germans, European Blacks, Africans, and African Americans in the Nazi Era. And I was kind of flabbergasted because I had never even thought of or considered that there was Black people who were victims of the Holocaust or in concentration camps or in ghettos and all of this stuff. And so that obviously got me interested. So I came to grad school, I came to Stockton with the hope to do some kind of research or project on furthering that, because there's not a lot of information about the Black experience out there. So as I started my capstone research, I knew I wanted to look at testimony from Black people. And when I say Black people, I use that as an all-encompassing term. So I'm speaking of Afro-German, European Black in general, Africans, African Americans, mixed race children, etc. So as I started out my research to try and find some testimony, I noticed there's none, essentially. There's not a lot. what I ended up finding was a total of 6, 2 of which were donated testimony that was done by a researcher some years ago in the 90s. And from there, I formed the question of, because I was wondering, well, why isn't there testimony from Black people, from Black survivors? And then I also had a conversation at some point with, and I think he might be on here, Professor Marcus, where he thought I might want to look at liberators as well. And when I also looked for the voice of liberators, I saw there's also a almost non-existent voice and testimonies. Beyond that, I would think, well, since we know that there is Black people in Europe, there should also be some testimony as bystanders, for example. None. There's no testimony from any Black person who would be considered a bystander. So in addition to trying to answer that question of, well, what happened? Where are these voices? Where are these people's stories? I also wanted to try and seek out some people to speak to. Of the people that I personally interviewed, one is the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. He was a survivor of Mauthausen, and he died in 2019, unfortunately, so I wasn't able to speak to him firsthand. But she did, at the time that she and I became acquainted, she had just published a book about him and his experiences. And she also performed her own series of testimonies, if you will, with him, where she sat down with him with a camcorder and just hours and days at a time, like asked him questions about his experience. Beyond that, I also was able to find a Black woman who grew up in Hamburg, Germany, and I would consider her more of a bystander to the Holocaust, as her story is very more as a witness. She did not enter a camp or anything like that, and she eventually came to America. So I spoke with, she died in 2020, I believe, and but she does have a recorded testimony that was performed by an art teacher, actually, in 1995. And in 2018, he posted it on YouTube. And that's how I was able to track down her family. So I spoke with her son and her grandson, and, I was just able to get some information about her life, what it was like for them growing up. Eventually, they all returned to Germany. So he grew up in Germany directly following the war. So beyond that, I also spoke with people from archives. I focused primarily on the USC Shoah Foundation, Fortunoff Archive, and the USHMM, because they house archives, and 2 of the interviews that I found from a scholar that was donated was at USHMM. I spoke with the curator and then the head of the Fortunoff Archive. I also spoke with a woman named Deborah Bush at Fortunoff. Well, she recently retired, but she was with Fortunoff Archive for 33 years under, trying to remember her name, Joan Rudolph, excuse me, under Joan Rudolph. So she worked there for 33 years, and she was the only Black person on staff, in essence. So I wanted to also get her perspective on what it was like working within an archive, particularly an archive that was gathering testimony on Holocaust survivors. Oh, you're muted.
So Fabulous. In starting this research, just getting the names, could you tell us just how, what challenges you met just trying to trace down where there were names of people that you could even trace down? And also, how did you come to this incredible idea of talking to archivists about why they didn't, why they left out, or why they did not have more of these interviews? Where did that wonderful idea come from? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So some of the challenges I faced were, there's this weird, I don't even know how to describe it really, almost a secrecy with trying to locate people. So for example, there's a documentary that was done back in 1998 about some survivors, some Black survivors. And I reached out to the director and the producer to see if they had any, sources or any kind of documentation that could maybe lead me to, if not the actual people, then some relatives who may or may not still be alive. And they claim to not have anything, like any kind of documentation from that, which is very odd and weird to me. Another struggle I found was when I would reach out to some scholars who I know, wrote books where they had interviewed people. They were also very didn't want to talk, knew nothing. So that was rough. And for example, when I found the woman whose testimony is on YouTube from that art teacher that interviewed her, when I tracked him down, and emailed him to see if he could give me information on how I could locate, get in contact with the family, he acted at first like he had no idea what I was talking about. He even told me I had the wrong person, it wasn't him. And I essentially had to just delve out kind of all, how I know that it's him, what I did to research him and find that he's connected to this YouTube account and that, I know this is legit. So that was very odd to me. I didn't quite understand what all of the secrecy seemed to be. In terms of the archives, what made me think of it is probably in the discussions I had with you, where we would get to this precipice of just but why? And there's no literature at this point, I don't think anyway, that really answers that question or has any of those questions posed. So who better to answer that question of why than the people who work within the archives?
So could you tell us a little bit more detail about when you approached the Fortunoff archive? Was one of the first big archives of Holocaust testimonies. Right. It was supposed to be state-of-the-art interviewing and very fine scholars involved in setting that up at Yale. It still is a very incredible collection, a little different from the Shoah collection, but certainly a very interesting one. So when you talk with them and you tried to learn about, what did you find? How do they explain their selection process? Or did they not even think about other voices? How was that? How did they explain it to you? Yeah.
So Stephen Nairn, the director of the Fortunoff Video Archive, he explained to me their method of gathering the testimony, which was essentially, they put things out. It was the best way he describes it is word of mouth. They put out advertisements, of course, within communities, and the communities they targeted were, of course, Jewish communities, synagogues, Jewish newspapers, etc. But, they also have an international audience that they got a testimony from. And he said it was just very much like a word of mouth thing. If somebody knew somebody who they thought might want to do a testimony, they told them about it. And then that person would reach out to the archive.
And did they never think of broadening, of going to other groups of victims? I mean, the Fortunoff archive mainly deals with not just Jews, but mainly with Jewish victims. Was there any thought process in this, or was this just the way they perceived Holocaust and what they would go after for interviews? How did it get restricted into this niche, if you will?
The short answer is no, they didn't even think about it, is the short answer. There was an explanation of, well, just because of how we, by word of mouth, of how we reach out to people to get the testimony, that was a hindrance. But no one ever thought of reaching out to other groups. Stephen Nairn, he brought up, there's also a lack of LGBTQ testimony as well. So, he does point out, they do have, now that he thinks about it in the conversation that we were having, that they do have holes. And no one ever thought to go beyond that. No one thought to bring it up. And they certainly were not going to seek it out because that's just not their methodologies. But personally, I feel that it's the not altering their methodologies is part of the problem, but particularly not being willing to alter that methodologies with certain groups, because as I saw with trying to find testimony, there are just some groups that are not going to come forward by virtue of the fact of A, how we perceive a Holocaust survivor, who we perceive a Holocaust survivor to be, and B, just extenuating factors or circumstances, such as, for example, a Black person may not live in a primarily Jewish community. So of course, a newspaper may not have reached them.
Okay. Oh, I mean, that's the Fortunoff archive. You also went to the USC Shoah archive that has a little bit different way of gathering testimonies. Did they have any more opportunity to interview Afro-Germans or Black victims that you learned from them?
So within the Shoah Foundation, they have one Black person who's they have listed as a survivor of eugenics. So it was what would have been considered a Rhineland bastard. Beyond that, they have two testimony from in their Black liberator category. However, those two testimonies are from the same man. So in essence, they have two testimonies that would be a part of this group that I'm talking about, or of the Black voice, or the within the Holocaust narrative. And the way that they gathered, particularly early on, the way that they gathered testimony was, so Crispin Brooks, the curator there, let me backtrack a bit. He talked about how when the Shoah Foundation first, came to be, when they were trying to gather testimony, Spielberg went on Oprah and, talked about that they were looking for people to do testimony, X, Y, and Z, and they put a phone number up for people to call. When people called that number, there was this little, what he called the survivor flyer that had basic information such as their name, their address, phone number, and what their experience would be. And from there is how they decided who would be picked to be interviewed. The problem with that is he was unable to answer if anybody would have been turned away, why they would have been turned away if they were. So in my mind, that's kind of still up for debate, because he can't exactly answer who would have been picked or why somebody might not have been picked, like what would have fallen out of the category of what they consider to be a survivor. And also they had another method, which is of gathering people to interview, which is very similar to the Fortunoff, which was putting it in advertisements, specifically advertisements that were in the Jewish community.
So my question to you, and we've talked about this, if it was out in advertisements, why didn't some Blacks who were descendants or who were familiar with relatives or friends that had been victims, why didn't they come forth? Why wasn't there, did they not feel that they were part of this story, or were they not conscious of their own heritage? Just explain to me why they wouldn't have jumped at the chance to fill out those forms and join the Shoah Foundation, right?
Right. Well, I think it's a number of things, but even with that, like I said, we have to remember they might have called in to fill out those forms, and we have no idea if they would have been turned away or not. We can't even answer that with complete in one way or another. But beyond that, I think, we have to think about the Fortunoff, where they started their interviews in the late 70s, the 80s. And during this time in America, because I very much keep my research to the Americanization of the Holocaust, that's why I only looked at these three main ones in America. There was still quite a bit of racism at the time. What a Holocaust survivor was may not have been in line with how a Black person might have viewed themselves. There also may have been some latent prejudice where somebody might not have, like I said, they might have like written out that information, like somebody might have come to them and they might not have gotten a call back. Again, we don't know. It could also be, and I lost my train of thought on this. I completely forgot my other point, but if we also think about, I remember the Holocaust studies was still in its infancy. So I'm trying to think if, put yourself in the viewpoint of somebody in the late 70s or 80s. If you aren't in a community where you're getting word that this place is wanting to do testimony of people who lived in Europe during this time and might have been affected by, the Nazi policy, how would you know? Like, really, how would you know? And to even come forward. In terms of liberators, what I think is that, again, I'm looking at perspective. And if I'm a Black man who prior to going to Europe experienced prejudice and racism, and then I'm coming back to America and experiencing prejudice and racism, and in general, you're on a scale where people don't really want to hear what the Black community has to say. They don't want to hear their voice in any regard. Why then would a Black person think, or a Black man think, okay, well, now they want to hear my voice. I don't think that was at the top of their minds or their agenda, that their stories would even be something that anybody would be interested in hearing. And maybe in light of the fact of all the racism going on in America, they thought, well, I have bigger fish to fry, so to speak, than to go and speak about something that happened to what they might view as a white tragedy.
I need to also ask Irvin a little bit to join in on this for a second, because there is, this is not the same story as some of the things you've been seeking, but Leon Bass was one of these liberators who did speak from, I think, Gail, didn't he start in the 70s or even earlier?
So I never like correcting Dr. Johnson, but I have to correct you that my students, please don't start counting backwards how old I am. But my first job, Leon Bass, was the principal of my school, and that was in the fall of 1968. In the spring of 1974, I saw a flyer, advertising that Leon Bass, African-American educator, currently principal of Benjamin Franklin High School in Philadelphia, was speaking about his experiences during World War II. And I thought, this is not the Leon Bass I knew, because he never spoke about it. So Irvin will share with you the incident that happened, but he didn't immediately speak about it. He left it behind him, just like so many of us do that with coping mechanisms. And I don't know if Fabulous would agree with this, but having to do with racism. Who cared? Nobody wanted to talk about it. Even liberators that, were not victims of racism, people wanted to move on. And so, Irvin, do you want to say what turned the corner for Leon Bass?
Yeah, so he was principal of Benjamin Franklin High School. And one day he was walking down the hallway of his school, and there was a particularly loud class at the end of the hallway. So as principal, he thought maybe he could calm down the students. And so he went into the classroom, sat in the back to calm the class down, because they had a guest speaker. And the guest speaker happened to be a Holocaust survivor who was telling her story. And the class actually didn't really listen to Dr. Bass, and they just were loud and kept talking over the speaker. And he stood up in front of the class and he said, you need to listen to this person because what she's telling you is real. And I witnessed it and I saw the death. And after that, the students didn't give any problems to the speaker. And afterwards, this particular Holocaust survivor, who was a music teacher in the Philadelphia school district, she went up to Dr. Bass and told him, "You have a story to tell." And he listened to her, and I actually had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Bass's daughter, Dahlia, and she told me that Dr. Bass never talked about his experiences, and what Dr. Bass experienced was he was there. He was a witness to the liberation of the Buchenwald concentration camp, and he saw and when he was there for liberation, there was a Holocaust survivor there, Robbie Weissman, who wrote in his journal that when he saw Dr. Bass, he saw God for the first time and he was Black. And there's this really interesting PBS documentary or video that I have yet to track down of Robbie Weissman and Dr. Bass reuniting in Canada. So yeah, Dr. Bass did not speak for a long time, and he ended up working with Facing History and ourselves and becoming a speaker all over the United States, particularly in the South. And you know, a lot of it too was after World War II. Fabulous, stated this earlier, that as a Black GI, he faced many obstacles in the United States, trying to go to school using the GI Bill, and even staying in housing, which he was turned away from that. So he still dealt with the racism he went to Europe to fight against.
It started in the 80s with Facing History. So, but this all gets to, I'm going to come back to Fabulous because she and I have spoken about this. I'm wondering how much Black identity played in thinking that this is something that others need to hear about, or do they just want to keep a sort of low profile for this, even into the 80s and 90s, when you have increasing awareness from as Jewish survivors begin to speak out a little bit? And is there a different sense of identity in terms of giving those interviews? I don't know on that. And that's something I think that Fabulous has explored a little bit. I wonder if we can bring her back to this discussion.
So again, I think in terms of just being in America, I can't imagine that because these archives were not targeting communities or locations where, a black person coming from Europe may have lived. I think it's just like hard for that person to come forward, because how do you know that a place is giving testimony if it, like, I think of it from this perspective. If I were not, even in today's time, if I were not in this field, I'm not sure that I would know what the Fortunoff archive is, or like maybe even the USC Shoah Foundation. I'm not sure I would know what that is if I was not in this field. So unless you have some sort of connection, or in the way that these archives have sought put out notification like, hey, please come speak with us. We want your testimony. We want second generation testimony, blah, blah, blah. How would they know? But I did look at a little bit of identity in what the Black identity would be in Europe. And there wasn't much of one. And that had varied at the time during the World War II era. And that had a lot to do with several things. One, there wasn't, compared with like the white European population, there wasn't that many Black people. I think the estimate that I found most commonly, because it hasn't been researched a lot, there's a lot of back and forth about what the actual number is, but of Europe, they estimate about 55,000. So the community wasn't that large. beyond that, you have people of varying backgrounds of what the Nazis would have considered Black. So you had, because of the racism in America, a lot of jazz musicians came over and were performing in Germany. And, they eventually got locked up in concentration camps and then had to return to America. So you had that Black American community in Europe. You had scholars who were Black coming over doing research. You had Africans from the colonies, and then you had what the Nazis would have considered Rhineland Bastards, but then you also had what the Nazis called brown babies, who were, if you were a child that was half German and half Black, but Black from another kind of Black, not a French soldier Black. So there was these varying categories. And whenever there was some form of community, the Nazis did have policies to kind of, I think, start to break apart those communities. For example, the son of the woman who lived through it that I mentioned earlier, he talked to me about how his grandfather, who came from Africa, his grandfather attempted to build a community of people from his area of Africa. And even though he doesn't know the details of what happened, his grandfather was shortly thereafter forced to leave Germany and sent back to Africa, and he never returned to Germany. There are other instances where there's a lot of propaganda, of course, against jazz, where they try to, bring Jewish people into, they use Black people, and therefore we can't have jazz. That's a whole other area of propaganda in itself. But again, they broke apart these communities where there would have been some form of connection. So the identity and essence of Black people in Europe is almost non-existent.
So they wouldn't have perceived themselves as that they needed to tell the story, or what? I mean,
I think they would perceive themselves after the war that they would not need to tell the story, because it's become so. I mean, I think the way, particularly in America, the way that we present it is that it is it's a white European experience. And we don't see, for example, there's also like Filipinos and Asian people, Hispanic people in the camps, and we don't see that.
we haven't really researched that in the same way. But
Right.
and how, I mean, you're guessing on this. As a researcher, how would we find more of this? How would we get more at that? How would we be able to get at that? I don't know on that in terms of
Get more
why, why,
why.
I mean, why it's so hard to have this sense of identity. They had to have a feeling of identity. It's just maybe we're not going at it in the right, we don't have enough information of how to get at it. I do know we have that one memoir by Hans Massaquoi. Now he was rather unusual and well-educated and so forth. He gives us some perspective on this, but I don't know how we would find out more about who was this community and what did they think of themselves as a community, or were they, and you somewhat suggest that they probably didn't because there isn't enough of a concentration, but we don't, how would we get at that? I don't know. That's why I'm asking you.
I think the best way to have answered the identity and community question is it would have been if we had gotten their testimony, and unfortunately we don't have that. So that's the conundrum. That's the roundabout thinking of.
Given that, now let's get really specific. Take one or two of the testimonies you have had the joy of being able to look at and actually hear. And what do you learn from it? Let's take that first one from the daughter who was up in, I think, in the Boston area when she wrote her book. Tell us about that one a little bit more. What you learned from that. And from
so I asked her that question about, why didn't her father come forward? I was specifically interested in asking her that because his name is Lionel Romney. And if you were to, prior to her book, if you were to have Googled him, you would have found varying information about him, particularly a white soldier that was held in the camp of Mauthausen as a prisoner of war. He gives testimony at one of the Nuremberg trials where he references Lionel Romney, but he references him with improper information. Like he says that he is an African-American, he was from the Caribbean. He said that his occupation was, X, Y, and Z, and like that was wrong, all of this stuff. So I was particularly curious to ask her that question because in light of the fact that he kind of had information out there about him that was being told literally from a white perspective, why wouldn't he come forward and clear it up? And what she told me is that she very much feels, because she never heard her father's story until she was doing the video recordings, and he just kind of came out with it. It was like many years later, I think she was like in her 30s or something like that, and it kind of just all came out. And she thinks it was because of trauma, in essence, that it was just something it was such a traumatic experience for him that he just kept it all locked in, and it was kind of a secret within the family. There was a point that she knew he was in the camps because her mother secretly told her, you can never tell him that, So when it boils down to it, I believe it was that. And I asked her if, because he was kind of more noteworthy in that he was mentioned in several different places, if anyone ever tried to contact her father or her and reach out to her to do testimony or give the testimony. And what she told me is that he was contacted, but he was only ever contacted to give stories about that white man that testified at the Nuremberg trials, to be a part of his story. There's like books written about him, and they just wanted, I guess, in essence, to interview him about this other man. They didn't want his story.
They don't want his story. Okay.
Correct.
All right. And where does he end up? She actually sort of traces his journey after the war. What happens with him?
So he went to the Netherlands after the war, and then he eventually ends up in New York, and he lives out his life in New York.
And speaks about it very rarely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So, right. The other thing that you and I have talked about a great deal is there any group in Europe, especially in Germany today, of Afro-Germans, Blacks, that meet as a group that would be, trying to know a little bit more about their heritage? Is there any sort of consciousness that way in terms of a group?
Yes, I think in today's time, there's definitely more of a Black community. I think it'd be interesting to, if my project was involved with that. There's definitely a tighter community. They do a lot of work and marches there's like a Black Lives Matter organization that goes on over there in Germany specifically. If anyone who went to the Holocaust Awareness Museum in New York, in Manhattan, their old exhibit on Auschwitz, there used to be a clip of, again, I'm using Nazi terminology, a Rhineland bastard. And that video actually is a video that was taken from YouTube. And if I knew I was going to bring it up today, I would have brought up the name of the group that does it. But it's from a documentary where basically the Black community there is trying to learn more about their past, be that in Germany or where, the different people who now make up the Black community there, where they're from. But in terms of, aside from that man's testimony, that documentary they did on gathering his testimony, I don't see anything further or more specific about people who actually lived in Europe, who actually suffered experience, or any attempt to reach out to family members to gain any of that testimony. So not that I've seen.
So since several times we've talked about the Rhineland Bastards, could you describe what that group was for everyone, just in case some haven't come across that term?
Right. So what the Nazis termed the Rhineland Bastards were the at the end of World War I, with the agreement that Germany made was that soldiers would be placed in this territory called the Rhineland, and the French forces put in Black soldiers in the Rhineland. Now, when I don't know if I want to say Germans or Nazis, but when we say Black, there's of course Africans that they're referencing. They would have made up the Black soldiers, but also there is quite a number of Asians as well. But the Germans kind of all lump them together as the same thing. So to be Asian to them would also to be Black. And so the Rhineland Bastards references the unions of German women with these Black soldiers. And it's very specific to just these German women with the Black soldiers. When there is any other kind of mixing, like with a German father, with, you know, anything else, that would have had a different name.
Very specific attachment to that, right? So now I'm going to, because I'm getting ready to hear everybody's wonderful questions, but I just want to ask one more thing. The historian Doris Bergen, in her work, especially that work she's done called War and Genocide, which is kind of a primer for many of us. I don't know how many here on the Zoom have looked into her work, but what she does so incredibly, and I think it begins to enter into some of the things that you want to find out more about, but when she starts, she doesn't start talking about the Holocaust and the war years and what happened to non-Jewish victims, but she looks at Afro-Germans from the early 30s right on in there, and actually is has done more than others, I think, in trying to weave that story in. And my question is, why do you think other historians haven't sort of picked up on this and tried to, and I want to bring, if Steve Marcus is with us, I'd love him to come in on this, but why hasn't that become more of the story, and especially starting not in 39 in the war, but even before that, these groups were being targeted. Certainly Jews are the main groups that are targeted, but there are these other groups, and she tries to weave that in. And I'm just wondering why that isn't done more regularly in other in basic histories.
Right. So I'm glad you brought this up, because that actually reminded me something I wanted to bring up, which is, and I'm going to say this getting to the answer of that question, or my perceived answer of the question, which is when I spoke with Crispin Brooks at USC Shoah, he mentioned how they did consult a lot of historians and scholars on who they should get, what kind of people should be included in this testimony. And Yehuda Bauer wrote a very long and detailed letter. He went country by country, talking about different groups of people that would have been persecuted. And Crispin Brooks is still looking for a copy of that letter. I really hope he finds it. But in essence, what the testimony as it is today, very much so is a reflection of that letter. So they really took what he said as a historian, a scholar, to heart. They followed it. But noticeably, of course, what we have absent is the Black voice. So that, I think that makes you wonder, why did this, and again, I'm guessing, did he leave this group out? Which we, of course, won't know unless that letter's found. But so going back to it, I think what it boils down to is a prejudice, but I'm not sure if it's a conscious prejudice or not. Being is that I'm, specifically looking at the Americanization of the Holocaust, and if I'm thinking of it in terms of America, in light of the prejudice that we just naturally bring to the table, whether on a conscious level or not, I just don't think anyone thought about it. When I spoke with, and those who did speak about it, as I think everyone that I spoke to they told me they believe that there is a prejudice in academia, and in some regard, and sometimes they thought it was blatant, and other times they did think it was just a slip of like not thinking about it. So Deborah Bush, the woman who worked at Fort Chenal for 33 years, she told me that it wasn't until like our conversation, she was speaking to me, she was like, now I wonder, like my grandfather was a soldier during World War II, and he went overseas to Europe. And now I think, should I have mentioned this to him? Could I have like included his story into the testimony? So in some ways, it's just we don't think about it. But then in other ways, with historians who knew, they knew that Black people were affected, it was just a blatant disregard.
Wow. We certainly need to get more of that story woven in. So before we go to questions, I'd like to just ask you a thought. Where do you think we should be going in terms of research from where you've gone? Where are some avenues to go now? Where are some further things to be doing? And what, I mean, you've already found a lot of holes, but what other things do you think we should be looking at or finding out about?
So in terms of I actually had this written down somewhere, is what I'm looking for. In terms of testimony, I think obviously in some regards, it's just too late unless there's an initiative to just get second generation testimony. I think there's some room to go there. We can look for second generation testimony. But also I think the archives, not just with Holocaust testimony, I think moving forward with any genocide that they decide to collect testimony with, they should change their methodologies. Because while I understand in one regard not wanting to just go out and blatantly ask people like, hey, come give us, or we invite you to give us a testimony, it also probably would have been better at some point to change up their methodologies to do that. Because unless you go out and you seek some people to speak to, you're just going to end up missing a voice entirely. And in this regard, I found, it's not just the Black voice is missing. Like, as I mentioned earlier, there's other groups that were missed as well. In terms of, I just think that there's a ton of research that still needs to be done with the Black experience, because when I'm looking at different books and articles in my within my research, what I'm finding in the notes and everything that they reference, where they're getting their information from, it's like referencing the same sources. So all the new material is kind of being referenced from what's already been referenced. So we're just, what we do have is just kind of redundant and repeating. You could probably read like 3 articles in a book and know everything else that's going to be in another article or a book. Mm-hmm. And that's sad. But I think we also really need to look at, so Nazis have given testimony about how Black people were buried in mass graves separate from Jewish people. So that's a whole different avenue to explore. Where are the mass graves? Are there any, did they find these mass graves? Do they know where they are? Are any monuments going to be placed there in the same way that they are with, Jewish mass graves? I think it would also be really interesting to look at how, well, we know like the Nazis wanted to take over Africa after taking over Europe, and a lot of testing was done on Black people, specifically for how, I didn't look into too deeply, but they wanted to know how Germans could survive in the Black environment. And I think that's a completely also a different avenue to explore of what kind of testing was being done. For a period of time, bones were still being held and collected in German archives from, these testings. So, all of these are things like unanswered questions left to be explored.
So part of their racial research, is that what the collection was about? Right. Yeah. So, yeah, you talk about that maybe they should change their methodology for collecting interviews, but how? What specific way might you do to get this broader picture, to get something that might include non-Jewish victims? What would be how would you change the methodology there?
Well, as I said, beyond changing the whole wait for them to come to us perspective, I think there has to be people who go out and seek that. Also, I think there needs to be more diversity within the fields in general, within the archives, within the scholarship, just in general, because what I also asked everyone I interviewed, I asked about the racial makeup of the people who worked there, the people who did the interviews, and the people who work there currently. And, we basically just have this one Black woman that I have to show for that. Like, why could there not have even been some, Black people to perform the interviews?
Right.
Or Hispanic people or Asian people, any of that. So I think maybe had they had more visiting scholars, Deborah Bush, she told me that in her whole time there, the whole 33 years there was only one Black visiting scholar. And, perhaps if we expand the range of the kind of scholars we, accept in the programs, hire for archives and all of that, this might have been something that wouldn't have been missed. Somebody at some point along the way might have said, hey.
So we've got to dig up Yehuda Bauer's letter and find out what he says there. So I think, Ervin, it's time for us to get to some of these questions. She's given us so much to think about. Can we start with some of the questions that you've been gathering?
Sure. I will go in the order that I did receive the questions. The first question we received from a Stockton student is, for Fabulous, are there any memorials dedicated to the Black victims of the Holocaust that you know of?
Not the Black victims. What I do know of is, and I'm probably going to butcher his name. So there is a man, Hilarious Giles, who died in like 1927. I would have to double check that like right now. Actually, I'm going to do it right now because it's going to bother me if I get it wrong. 1933. He was murdered right after Hitler came to power. Because he was very active in a movement that was against the Nazis. And he was taken from his home in the middle of the night in front of his family, who, by the way, his daughters were still alive and never interviewed for any testimony. But anyway, and he was killed. He was like stabbed 27 times. Like, he had an awful murder. And there is a plaque up with his face on it, and it says his story. And there's also a plaza in Dusseldorf named after him. Aside from that, there is, and Professor Hayes would probably know more about this than I do. They're called the Stumbling Stones. I forget how they're pronounced.
The Stolperstein, yeah.
Stolperstein. Mm-hmm. There's a few Stolperstein that are dedicated to a couple of Black people who were victims of the Nazis.
I didn't know that. Wow, thank you. And I will turn it over to Dr. Morris for the next question. Dr. Morris?
I'm so glad that I got to see this, Fabulous, because I've been so interested in this project since you came to us, right? Because there's one thing I really love about this project is the way that it like splits the fiber of what we know to look at these spaces that we haven't interrogated, right? And it's like, last semester, you told us the story about when you were working in the museum and how when the video of the one Black survivor stopped working, they were just like, oh, right, and as you were talking just now, and I'm sorry if you've already gotten to this because the pennies just dropped for me, but I was wondering, is there some way to think about this gap in knowledge as a kind of extension of both Nazi conceptions of Germanness and broader global white supremacy at the time that, right, there wasn't a sort of a dominant thought that we should look to the Black experience, because even in the United States at the time, the troops were still segregated, right? And maybe like we're looking at the perpetrator's definition of what's Germanness and what's not, right? And because sort of like Jewishness is targeted, but Blackness is not targeted as Blackness, right? But as other undesirable, etc. I'm wondering, like, is there a way in which that sort of lens is part of what creates this gap in knowledge, right? There wasn't an acknowledgement of the full humanity of Black people worldwide,
Yes.
right?
Yep. And that's what I try and get at anyway in my paper, which is that it's also this studying the Holocaust in an American mindset. We are coming at it with the past of America that we don't want to acknowledge. And when we acknowledge, I think if there is too much close of an acknowledgement to Black people, like I hate to put it in like such finite terms as I'm about, or blatant terms as I'm about to say, but it's like, well, we don't care about the Black experience in America. We don't care about the Black experience in Germany or Europe, anywhere in Europe either. And that's what I think transferred over. There's just kind of the universal of, well, we didn't even think about it because we don't care what happened in slavery. We don't care what happened in civil rights. So why are we caring about this?
So Fabulous, I do want to follow that up with the question. Do you think that with the changing concepts of victims or how they're defined amongst groups of scholars, do you think that will impact the way that testimonies and other artifacts are collected or will be collected in the future?
I hope so, particularly in regards to other mass atrocities. I would hope so. When I think about collecting artifacts, though, I always, for some reason, that just makes me think of, how like the British Museum, for example, or like mummies, where I think about we've taken these artifacts that are very specific to like people's culture, and we've like human bodies that was sacred to somebody, we've undug and taken from their cultures. And even when African cultures have come back to the British Museum and said, like, can you please give us back this sacred whatever, and because it's very important to us for this reason, and you're profiting off of it, and like we're from a poor country. That's what I think about with artifacts. And I don't think in terms of artifacts that will change. I think as long as there is a monopoly or money on the table to be had, I don't think that's going to at all change.
Thank you. And Dr. Johnson, they wanted to follow up with you as a scholar in the field today. What can you do or other scholars do to begin to address these oversights and gaps in the collection of Black testimonies or other minority group testimonies?
Christina and I would be together on this, to have other wonderful Stockton students asking these questions and pushing us to why has that been left out, and what do we do to fill in those holes. I hope that it's not too late to get some of this information, or maybe we. I think it's more like third generation, even Fabulous, and not just second generation. It would have to be to try to reach out. But what can we at least retrieve? But with other, and you also mentioned with other genocides, I think that's very important in terms of the questions we ask, and then what are the blinders that are on some scholarship that graduate students are beginning to sort of pull apart and pull off and say, hey, wait a second, let's look at this. And I think that's one of the things that you've done so well, Fabulous, is to just try to push us on this. Why is it not there? We do know something about Black liberators. There was even a film done until it was canned. But this whole question, which I had never really thought about, is why don't we have testimony? Why is that and it took you to sort of push on that. So that's where I am, and waiting for more thoughts on, that come from students asking these questions. And
I add on to what Mary said. Oh, please, Mary, I'm sorry, I thought you were finishing.
no, I'm done. Yeah.
Oh, okay. That like, we may not be able to remedy the gap in terms of Holocaust scholarship, right? It may be that the best we can do is point to the gap and highlight it so that we become more aware of looking for those gaps moving forward, right? That like you were saying, like we have to recognize the blinders. And the thing is, like, I think it's always super hard to see what we're not seeing, right? But I think if we continue to point out, like even with students, right? When I say, okay, look, when we look back to the 70s and there was no sexual harassment, you just had a creepy boss, right? Like until we had a way to talk about it, it didn't exist. And we can't go back and remedy the wounds before that, but we can now be more aware of, right? Like looking for those gaps, I think.
Yep.
Anyway, just my thought.
No, I agree with that. Yeah. And that's what's so much fun of working with graduate students at Stockton, right? Yeah. So, but let's get back to questions for Fabulous.
This one is a comment. A Stockton student is commenting on the fact that the Black experience during the Holocaust is based on so little sources, and they're asking, Fabulous, are we limiting ourselves with the African American experience in the United States in general? Do you think there's a gap there in testimonies and?
Ouch.
Yeah. Yes and no, because I think in general, the public education we receive about the Black experience is very minimal, limited, or retold in a slightly different way. That actually doesn't have historical or educational value. At the same time, I think people who, so I'm half Black, for example, and the way I was raised, my mother always made sure I knew details about civil rights or Black history or slavery. So I think the Black community is more open and prone to having their stories told within their community. I think the problem is getting past the Black community and allowing their voices to be heard throughout education, not just in African studies or Africana studies or, et cetera.
And the follow-up to that is, how do you think your research today will positively impact the lack of focus of Black victims during the Holocaust?
I'm trying to not be a glass half full kind of a person. My honest opinion is I don't think it will. I think unless somebody takes it on and wants to, there's this drive to actually continue on and do research on it, I don't think it will. But my goal has always been that, I think the Black victim should be a course. It should be taught alongside Holocaust studies just as much as we would any other subject matter within the Holocaust. I mean, we have Holocaust classes about the cinema of the Holocaust. We should definitely have one about this victim group. So I think unless we continue to have it integrated into the Holocaust narrative, it's not going to have any effect.
Wow.
When I think about some of actually all three primary articles you will find about the Black experience in the Holocaust, there was one written in 1999, one written in 1992, one in 98, and then the final one in 2013. And they're all from the same journal, which is the University of Chicago Press in association with the study of African American life and history. And what's interesting about that is it's the African American life and history. It's not even within a Holocaust journal,
There is more recognition, though, of thinking about Black liberators, which is a little different from your angle on it. And I guess that's more the thinking of the American story and the war story. So there has been a little bit more on that, perhaps, but certainly not from the perspective you brought out. So.
And another Stockton student asked, what are you planning to do with the results of your research?
I would like to have it published, ideally in a Holocaust journal. So we'll see.
And I wanted to follow that up with a comment from a student. I just had to comment, even though there's not many sources, I want Fabulous to know she taught me a lot tonight. This is the first time I have ever learned about the Black experience during the Holocaust, and I am grateful for the knowledge. I think she did a great job explaining everything. Thank you so much. So thank you, Fabulous. That's just a comment. And I wanted to make sure that you heard it. Another question is, will this research assist you in obtaining or going or furthering your professional goals to work in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies? Or are you planning on entering a different field?
I would love to work in the field of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I would love to be a professor in the field. I just need somebody to hire me. So, Gail, get on your connects.
And a student is asking, how complete do you think your research feels with limited sources and testimonies?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I'll ever be completely satisfied with it, only because I think I would love a much larger field of people to speak to. There's so many other Holocaust institutions that I would have loved to reach out to, get their perspective on it. There are scholars I would have loved to reach out to, like in lieu of not finding the letter from Yehuda Bauer. I would love it if I could actually ask him about it. So I guess if I had to give it a scale, I think I feel like I'm at a 50%, because I think I'm at the starting point, but there's so much more that can be explored.
Okay, and this is one of the final questions. Fabulous, what are the lessons for today as a result of your capstone research project?
Wow.
Ask questions, I would say. Particularly when it's an underrepresented group, no matter what kind of group that is, ask questions. I would love somebody to also tell me more about, the Asian people who were also in camps, or who were also soldiers, who were just lumped in as Black people of the Holocaust. We have no idea what that number of people is. We may never know, but just I think with anything you study in history, you have to ask these questions, because something I always quote now, because of a reading I got from Dr. Morris's class, is, every way of seeing is another way of not seeing something. One way of telling a history is also another way of not telling somebody else's history. Where you start at in your story is also going to determine the narrative. So we need I think just the takeaway should be get that other story, in the same way that a journalist would be required to get both sides of the story. Historically, you need to get all sides of the potential stories out there.
And you think if we get these other stories fleshed out more, that this is going to only deepen our understanding and appreciation of how much is in this history? I mean, that it just gives us an even bigger picture of what it entailed, and will change, our more traditional narrative is going to be enriched, it seems to me, by looking at this. Yeah.
I do. And I also think it's important because I think we have a much more diverse world now, or a much more diverse America right now. And by all, I think the best, we're always trying to get students interested and involved in learning about the Holocaust. And I think the more range and the more you have to offer to the study, the more you're going to get different kinds of people interested in the Holocaust for different types of reasons. The same reason you have graduate students entering our program with different ideas of what they want to study in mind.
And fabulous. We have another comment, bravo in all caps with an exclamation point. We remember where your research started and where we need to go today, and there's more research to do in the future. So congratulations. So thank you. And Dr. Johnson, there's one question following up on what Fabulous was talking about is how has being Fabulous's advisor during this research capstone project changed your thinking in how Holocaust education deals with these forgotten victims?
Wow. Then we got to get it. We've got to broaden our perspective and bring it in and find ways to, I think more and more, we go back to some of that eugenical thinking of how people saw we and they as a way to bring in the number of victims there were, certainly Jews being so primary to all this, but many other groups of non-Jewish victims. And I think to develop ways to bring, and certainly Steve and others who have done courses on non-Jewish victims, I think it's helped a great deal about thinking like this. I don't know if Steve is with us today, but it's very important that we bring that in. I'm thinking that the research on the Roma and the Sinti, which has been much more extensive in recent years, has certainly been now more integrated into what we teach about it. And certainly with Fabulous's work, we're going to have more to bring in to our story. So I just think it pushes us to broaden that perspective. And under all of this, I go back to thinking that what are basic human rights for all people, and what happens and how do they get violated? And so that all these groups having their human rights violated, and how does this happen? And so that's the kind of questions I think we have in terms of creating courses and trying to bring these stories in.
I'm so sorry. I want to add on to what Mary said again, because it sparked something that I'd actually mentioned to Fabulous earlier, and that's like with the Roma and the Sinti, right? There's been more attention to the Roma and the Sinti once our awareness was raised about these groups as such. However, in the 1990s, in the wars in Bosnia, people talk about the Muslim victims, or like the Serbs, the Croats, the Bosniaks, or even the Kosovar Albanians, right? But also that those countries have a really large population of Roma people, and there is zero attention to what happened to those Roma people during the wars of the 90s, right? Wow. So and so, like, as I think, like, something that just occurred to me while Fabulous was talking is that for something to be considered a human rights violation, that group has to be considered human, right? And there's an extent to which the ignoring of the experience of the Roma in the wars in the 90s, right, coupled with the fact that we've paid more attention to the experience of the Roma in the Holocaust, I think that sort of echoes what Fabulous is talking about, right? How, like, the gap is there in part because of the lack of recognition of the humanity of the group as such.
Absolutely.
I feel like my brain has just gotten on fire from this presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. And unfortunately, I know students have to go to class. I just want to thank everyone for coming to this presentation for a very important discussion. Thank you, Fabulous. Thank you, Dr. Johnson. The comments today were amazing, and Dr. Morris couldn't have said it better. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to call the Holocaust Resource Center at 609-652-4699. I know that we could not get to all of your questions today. I will ask my director, Gail Rosenthal, if she wanted to say anything before we tuned out today.
Well, I'm going to read what I wrote, and part of it was bravo. Thank you for echoing my words, and fabulous. I know you since the day you arrived here at Stockton.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of you. I know Christina representing the MAHG faculty and Mary both remember when you started this research, and thank you. And you're an inspiration. Some of my undergraduate students are here, and they have a proven interest in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and you've given them some ideas to think about how this goes beyond just learning dates, and it goes beyond just remembering the victims we always talk about. We never talk about this subject area that you have raised tonight. We rarely do. And let's go beyond Black History Month. That's a challenge for all of us. Thank you. Have a good evening, everyone. And thank you so much. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.